Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Jewish Historical Society evening with author Paul French. Paul has lived and worked in Shanghai for many years. He's an analyst and an author and has written several books on subjects which include historic Shanghai, North Korea, and the foreign journalists in China. His latest book, which is outside, Midnight in Peking, was a runaway success and has made the New York Times bestseller list, BBC Radio 4, Book of the Week, has been nominated for this year's Edgar Award, and it's being made into a mini series for film and TV, which should be amazing. It's a highly enjoyable book, and so if you haven't read it, I would recommend you do. Interestingly, scrolling through the glowing reviews this afternoon, I was somewhat amused to see that Time Entertainment, which had given it top billing, suggested that if you like this book, you might also want to read How to Know If You're Eating Horse Meat. I'm not quite sure what the connection is. Paul's talk this evening will centre around stories he stumbled across while doing his research and which he felt deserved to be told. Not surprisingly, this evening's anecdotes have a Jewish theme. They are not the stories that are constantly being churned out about the families with whom we're all very familiar, but untold stories of obscure Jews we're very unlikely ever to have heard of. Nigel? There'll be a brief Q&A at the end of the talk, so please can I ask you to turn off your mobile phones? I apologise again for starting so late, but it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Paul.
He needs to be higher, Nigel.
Okay, I don't need the stage, I don't think. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, we were supposed to do this in November, and I had a family thing I had to go back to London for, so I'm afraid I had to cancel it, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you very much to Howard for originally suggesting this, and for Judy for organising it. And originally it was sort of based around there's a couple of Jewish characters in Midnight in Peking, and we thought about that, but I just thought, seeing as I was going to get a bunch of Jews in a room in Hong Kong, then why not get onto my favourite subject, which is kind of bad Jews. And having lived in Shanghai for 20 years and been to endless presentations on, Sassoon, Hardoon, Ezra, Kaduri, and how wonderful they are and what philanthropic people they were and all of that, I just thought, honestly, do we need any more of that? So, and also, there's just tons and tons on those people, and there's also a lot of course, Shanghai memoirs of the Ghetto, the good, the bad, and the ugly in that collection as well. So I thought I would talk about some, in various research that I do around books that I've been writing, some of the sort of lost Jewish lives, the ones that, the ones that don't get recorded except in official papers and in the courts and in the police records and so on, if that even. And so I thought I'd talk about some of those people, not all bad, but Jewish people who did slightly different things, who made careers in China in slightly different ways, often involved in slightly dodgy things. We're going to have some prostitutes, we're going to have some pimps, a couple of murderers, what else have we got? As a drug dealer or two, robbers, thieves, basically fences, basically every kind of villain you can think of. I mean, Jews are not exclusive to any particular criminal trade or banking and things, but apart from that, then they tend to be pretty much across the gamut of them, often very good at it. But of course, it's not something that's talked about. And of course, I was always quite, growing up in London, my family originally from Whitechapel in London, the Jewish ghetto there. And of course, that's had its fair share of Jewish criminals and crooks come out of it, but they're not talked about very much. The Americans talk about theirs a lot more, probably got more of them. We all know those stories, Meyer Lansky and Murder Inc. and everything, but the British ones were not talked about so much, or the French ones. There were a lot of French ones in Paris and Marseille and so on, and some did end up coming out here, and just because, and in the way that Sassoon and Hardoon and people moved from Baghdad to Bombay to Hong Kong and Shanghai, of course, the flotsam and jetsam was moving that way as well. It wasn't just them. So there's all sorts of people that crop up. So I've just got a sort of broad selection of them. Some of them crop up in books that I've written and books that I'm writing. Some of them are stories that I keep meaning to do but haven't found a way to work in yet. I've just been sort of collecting these people, and I think they are, to be serious for a moment, I think they are part of the overall Jewish experience in Asia, particularly in China. And I've always thought that it was quite important to know about all sorts of Jews, but you know, they're not really necessarily talked about. That old joke, you know, Jewish family goes to the beach and son goes off for a swim and he gets into a little bit of trouble, and his mum runs up to the lifeguard and she says, my son, the doctor is drowning, right? You know, and if you sort of say, you know, Jewish family goes to the beach, the son goes off for a bit of a swim, gets into a bit of trouble, mum runs over to the lifeguard, my son, the pimp and drug dealer is drowning, right? The joke doesn't quite work as well, does it? So you know, they're not always talked about, and you sometimes get in trouble. But anyway, these people are all real, so we'll get on with it, I think. Go back fairly early. This is from the newspaper, from the North China Daily News in 1906. And as you can see, it says, murder in Hongkou, now Hongkou, north of the Suzhou Creek. A Russian Jewess, and you have to learn to read between the lines on criminals. A Russian Jewess was murdered at number 56 Scott Road on Wednesday afternoon in a most cruel manner. It appears that the deceased, a married woman named Liza Capera, whose husband is said to have been away from Shanghai for some years, there's a clue in that, was living with another woman who went to Yangtze-pu on Monday evening and celebrated the Jewish festival with some friends there. There was no other problem. So that's a very interesting little story that crops up in the newspaper. A Jewess, a Russian, on Scott Road, who claims to be married but whose husband seems to be nowhere around, and is living in a house with another woman, but seems to be quite observant and went along to a Jewish festival. That's a very interesting story. If you dig around on that story, you find that Liza or Liza Capera pops up in the records of the Shanghai Municipal Police under any number of different names. Elizabeth Shapira, she's got about 5 names that she crops up under. That's one of them. The idea that Scott Road, you have to know that Scott Road was what was then known as the trenches. It was a street of brothels and dive bars and bordellos that was used largely, it was the low end of the market, it was where the sailors went, it was where the rough trade did their business. It was not a particularly nice area. It comes up all the time in the records at that time for murders, stabbings, fights, all the good stuff that sailors get up to on shore leave. Prostitution, of course. And her husband is said to have been away from Shanghai for some years. What that means is that, of course, you know, she had, when you track this back on her passport applications, she had actually been born in that area where many Jewish immigrants came from in the late 19th century, Bessarabia. Now that kind of odd area around, well, that border moves all the time, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And she came from around there. She then appears to have been, she moved from there to London. She was trafficked, quite obviously. London was the centre for Jewish girls who were trafficked out of Eastern Europe. And then they were, by the various gangs, sent out to different parts of the British Empire or down to the Atlantic coast. One of the great sort of, it's been told, but not very widely, is that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the trafficked women business, the prostitution business from Eastern Europe, Jewish girls were quite often basically kidnapped and brought to through Brussels and Paris, often mostly to London, and then shipped out down what was called the Atlantic routes, which was everything from Argentina and Chile right the way up to the east coast of America and Canada, and of course down to the brothels that were working in the Kimberley diamond mines in South Africa and so on, and also to various parts of the British Empire. India, they pop up in India, they pop up, and of course in what was then just had been part of the British concession of Shanghai. This was an entirely Jewish business, I'm afraid to say. It was something they were very famous for. A lot of people that were shipped. There was another route that came out of the west coast of America, San Francisco, which was run by gangsters in San Francisco, and there was another route that came out of Marseille that was run by the Marseille gangs and the Corsicans out of there. But I'm afraid the trade out of London was a very notorious Jewish business. There are no end of cases of this. Liza Capera appears to be one of those. Clearly, in order to, it was very difficult for single women at that time to live in Shanghai. There was some sort of marriage, probably bigamous. She ends up out there. Her husband then goes back. They tended to go backwards and forwards. So you can follow these guys backwards and forwards. It will be the same guy. If you read the shipping registry, you'll find the same guy with 6 or 7 Jewish women coming out, stopping at Bombay, stopping at Singapore, stopping at Hong Kong, stopping there, dropping them off. They were trafficking them around. What then happened with this case was quite interesting. She obviously was working as a prostitute. She was living in a house with another woman who was a prostitute. What eventually happened, the police did investigate it. They found 4 or 5 suspects. Lots of people with words you don't hear much anymore. Like one suspect was a Lascar. You don't hear Lascar very much anymore, but there used to be lots of Lascar sailors floating around. There was a Chinese man that was involved, and there were several foreigners, all Brits actually, who had visited her within the last few days and who may have killed her. It was indeed a cruel murder. She was beaten around the head with something very sharp many times, and it was quite a nasty murder. There were lots of stories of men being seen climbing out the back window, but the problem was that Scott Road was a whole street of brothels. It was run by gangsters, not necessarily Jewish gangsters, all sorts of different gangsters at the time, and of course the place just shut down and no one talked about anything. So no one, I'm afraid, was ever arrested eventually for Liza Capera's murder. But there she was. She's an early example of a Russian Jewish prostitute working in the trenches in Shanghai. This is a later picture of the area around the trenches. That area, I'm afraid, has been completely redeveloped and all gone now. It's actually a Carrefour supermarket on top of this spot now. But this was one of the main bars. This is later. Down on the corner there, you can actually see a sailor with his little sailor hat on. And you can see that this is later than 1906, but this was the Hollywood bar, which again was really the centre of the trenches area and was a major centre for prostitution, gambling. There was a lot of illegal gambling went on, mostly run by Americans, and there was a lot of prostitution run out of the houses around this area. This is the only photo I know of that's like of an actual venue in the trenches. This was, as I say, after Liza Capera. The house that she was found in would have been of an earlier vintage than this and would have been nothing much more than a wooden shack, quite honestly, maybe 2, maybe 3 stories. I mean, a fairly rough old dwelling. It wasn't a rich part of town. It was literally in an area that was called the External Road. So if you know the north border of the Shanghai settlement up towards sort of Baoshan, what's now Baoshan and Jiabei, it was just there over in Chinese, although it was foreigners that lived and ran it. It was run by, the policing of it was slightly confusing. It was technically Chinese Shanghai, but very loosely policed. The Shanghai Municipal Police did go over and arrest and investigate cases. So it got into that whole mess, which so many things do, which happened to Pamela Werner's murder in 1937 and happened so many times, where who has jurisdiction and who has power to summon people before magistrates, who can arrest, who can question people, becomes very confused and very grey in the world of extraterritoriality and a weak Chinese state at that time as well. And also just, I mean, they did investigate the murder, but you don't get the impression from the files that they were really that bothered. She wasn't someone who counted particularly, you know, so they didn't really worry about it. She didn't tick, although she ticked the box of being white, which means you count a bit more than Chinese. You know, being Russian and a prostitute and in Hong Kong would have knocked you right down the scale of who gets investigated. Unlike, say, the Pamela Werner murder, where her father was a diplomat, she was white, she was English. You know, I mean, that's the top of the tree, isn't it? Really. So it doesn't really get any better than that.
How old would she have been? Sorry.
Liza Capera. As far as we can tell, I mean, one of the great things about researching prostitutes, or one of the bad things about researching prostitutes, is, and I should hasten, I only research dead prostitutes, by the way, I have to insist on this one quite often. But one of the great things about dead prostitutes is they all lie about their ages, and they all lie about their names. So about you know, there's about 7 different ages given for her at different places. It would seem that she was in her mid-20s, somewhere around there, which is pretty old for that business actually. So she probably would have been trafficked when she was about 14 or 15. So, you know, she probably would have got to Shanghai when she was 17 or so. So, you know, because they then could have married her so that she could travel and get the passport. Here's an interesting guy, Joseph Mazursky. I don't know much about him. I'm just sort of interested in him and I'm digging around a little bit. He was known affectionately, I believe, as the Jew. So if I'm coming to talk to the Jews, I might as well bring the Jew with me. Right? And Joseph Mazursky, it's not even quite clear where he was from. I mean, he seems to be one of those sort of Romanian Jews, somewhere out of that part of Eastern Europe. Anyway, he seems to have gone to America at first and then followed the fleet, well, as a lot of prostitutes did, but followed the fleet out to Chefoo, which is up on the Gulf of Pachili now, and was a fueling station, a coaling station for the Royal Navy originally, and then for the American Navy's China Squadron as well. He was mostly running businesses that targeted the American sailors. The American sailors and the British sailors, nowhere really, not in Blood Alley in Shanghai, which is the greatly named Blood Alley. Not anywhere really do you ever want to put American sailors and British sailors in the same bar, right? It tends that bars in most ports in China, including Shanghai and so on, were designated as either for Americans or for British. You put the two together and, you know, well, the Americans just get beaten up, don't they? So that's sort of, you know, it's not fair on them, little loves. So this is Joseph Mazursky. He comes out there and he realises that these guys need a bit of entertainment, but what they also need is some food. And they don't want Chinese food, of course. They want their corned beef hash and whatever American sailors eat. And so he sets up these places for them. American sailors, not always known for their pro-Semitic tendencies, I would suggest, but it seems that they actually did like him. I mean, he certainly wasn't shy about his ethnic and religious heritage. And this is the one in Chefoo. He eventually made enough money to open one in Shanghai as well, which he rather imaginatively called the Jews Shanghai. And there it is. There he is outside with some Marines. He doesn't look nervous. I'd be more nervous around a bunch of American sailors, but he doesn't look very nervous. In fact, there's lots of very fond, lots of reminiscences and memoirs, a lot of them self-published that pop up now. Do remember going there to eat, and as you can see, he had Chinese staff throughout. But you know, it was a sort of a home away from home, and it was known by the sailors. It's always referred to in their works as the Jews' joint. I don't know whether or not he was completely a bad Jew, in the sense of my history of bad Jews. There are lots of things that, of course, he was running various gambling and everything in the back of these places. He doesn't seem to have been running girls, but he was running liquor and he was running definitely craps. I don't even quite sure what craps is really, but he was doing craps. It's some sort of gambling that you're not really supposed to do, and he was doing that. The interesting thing, of course, that all of these guys, which everyone forgets, is of course Chefoo is a treaty port, as Shanghai, of course, was a treaty port. So an American in Shanghai was, of course, technically under extraterritoriality, subject to American law, and could be brought before the US court for China in Shanghai, tried by an American judge, and sent to prison. Well, they were either sent to prison in Bilibad prison in Manila, or they were sent back to McNeil's Island in the US, West Coast. The one law, and you do see lots of people getting arrested for infringing various American laws. American laws on vagrancy and things like that are very odd, and they could always get picked up for things like that. But the one law that nobody ever tried to enforce on the Americans, which everyone forgets when they're outside, was the Volstead Act. No one enforced prohibition on Americans. The idea that Americans in Shanghai, a hard-drinking town at the best of times, where most Americans tended to mix mostly in British-dominated circles, and we all know the British like a drink, that they never had that situation where the Americans couldn't get a drink, or no one ever insisted or tried to prosecute. Even the missionaries, and God knows there was lots of American missionaries around, being very pious and pompous, as missionaries do, tried to impose the Volstead Act in China or Shanghai. So it was quite a nice place to have a drink. So that's the Jew. I want to move. This is a woman who's fascinated me for quite a long time. Lily Flor. I came across this advert quite a long time ago. This is actually her life. We've actually, with a German guy, we developed it up as a script, which is sort of in pre-production in Germany, awaiting some sort of funding. We're trying to dip onto the EU gravy train and everything for this one, because there's not really any money apart from EU money for films in Germany. And she was Austrian originally. I saw this thing. I was very interested in nightclubs in Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. This was the Elite Bar on Medhurst Road, corner of Bubblingwell Road, round about what's now Nanjing Road West, very centre of town, international concession. A posh place. It was posh, newly decorated, no less. Although if you know anything about China, Shanghai and its climate, you'll know that everywhere is newly decorated, because otherwise you'd just have black walls and things from the mould and everything. Anyway, Lily Flor was there, and she's flattered to see you tonight at the newly decorated Elite Bar. And I just thought, like, wow, wouldn't that be a good night out to go and see Lily Flor at the, and then that she'd be flattered that I was there. So I sort of dug around on her a little bit, and sometimes you dig around on people and they're just nobodies, there's not really any story or you can't find anything. Her story is fantastic. Lily Flor was born in Vienna, in Leopoldstadt, the Jewish ghetto in Vienna, and she was part of a family Yiddish music hall act. And they used to appear at the Yiddish theatre in the cabaret in Vienna. Reviews were mixed. Some people thought they were awful. Some people thought they were hilarious. It was a comedy turn with Mum, Dad, and little Lily sort of playing. Well, we don't know what they actually did, but it seems like she sung a few cute songs. They told some jokes, you know, a bit of pratfalling, and then, you know, bring on the magician. Right? It was that kind of show. She was doing that. After the First World War, she packed her bags and went off to Berlin. And she started to work in the German UFA, the German film studios there. And she became a massive star of the German silent film. As you can see, she was a character actress, right? Usually comedic. These were quite big films. She worked a lot with this guy, Crespi Films. He was a Romanian Jew that made films at UFA. This was the heyday of German expressionist filmmaking. I mean, she was working on the same film sets as you know, the big German expressionist directors. And she did that for about 10 years. She married a Romanian Jewish guy who'd made a lot of money in Berlin, who then subsidized her making a whole film in Bucharest, which you can still see. It's known in Bucharest, in Romania, as the first sort of major motion picture that was ever made in Romania. It's not very good, but it's the first one that was ever made. She did all these sort of roles, and she became very famous. And then in the late 1920s, as you can see, these are postcards that used to be sold of her to fans and things like that she had. I mean, although she was a character actress, there she is traditional, you know, of course the 1920s, so she's doing the whole gypsy thing, which a lot of Jews did, as a sort of gypsy entertainment type thing, crossover. And there she is, of course, glamming it up a little bit. I'm not sure she was completely glamorous, but she that's obviously a bit of a sexier shot. She was doing very, very well, and then two things happened. Well, first thing that happened was, and it seems to be related, she was working on a film, and at the end of the day's filming, they all went to the cinema and they went to see The Blue Angel, Marlene Dietrich in The Blue Angel. And this is the first talking film from Germany, and they went to see that. And she saw Marlene Dietrich speak and sing on stage, and came out of that and never acted again in a film. Now, I don't quite know why, whether it was that she felt she couldn't be quite like Dietrich, or maybe she had an extremely strong accent. We don't really know what her accent was like, that it wouldn't have sort of suited talking film, and she realised the game was up. She stopped doing it. She went back to being a cabaret star. I mean, this is the heyday of the Berlin cabaret. You know, Liza Minnelli. Well, let's say Liza Minnelli, that's a bit of a popular culture reference. You know, of course, Christopher Isherwood and the stories that he wrote. We all know cabaret. And then, of course, you know, come the exclusion laws in the mid-1930s, she, as a Jew, was unable to work on the stage in either the film industry or on cabaret in Germany. She did not, although she had the contacts to go to Hollywood or Paris, which is where, and work in the French cinema or the American cinema, which is what most did. She went to Shanghai, where she doesn't seem to do anything for a couple of years, and then she pops up flattered to see you at the Elite Bar doing these performances. I've not met anyone or found anyone's reminiscences of her at that particular performance or what she did. I imagine it would have been, it was a fairly high-end crowd that went there. It wasn't the Jewish Ghetto crowd or anything. It was a fairly high-end crowd. So it would have been interesting to see what she did. However, and of course during the war she did not need to live in the ghetto. She wasn't a stateless refugee or anything. She had papers. But she did go into the ghetto a lot. There's two interesting things that she's involved in. This is from the Shanghai Echo, which was of course a German language Jewish newspaper. This is in the Jewish ghetto on Kunming Road, which is Kunming Road. I happen to live on Kunming Road, funnily enough. And their offices are just opposite. That building's still there. And you can see these are Jewish businesses advertising here. Mr. Cohen on the Bubbling Well Road, first class jewellery, I don't doubt it. Selected Dessins. Do you know? I don't know what Dessins are. I assume he meant designs, and it was a. There is something called a Dessin, isn't there?
Drawings.
Really?
Drawings.
Oh, fantastic! Well, that's that solved. I was accusing the Jews of not being able to spell, but there you go. And the Deli Cat, which is in a lot of people's memoirs of the Jewish ghetto at that time, as a great place to go and get food. Anyway, in the ghetto there was this one great opera that was written by Seligman and Schubert called The Mask Has Fallen, the Masken Fallen. And as you can see, it's the one great sort of original, really serious piece of culture to come out of that ghetto. Of course, there's lots of other stuff, but this was a real performance and a piece that's still performed occasionally today. And as you can see, Lily Flor is number 2 on the bill there, and so she did perform in this, and many people do remember her as being someone that they had known before they left Europe as a film star, and of course knew her as a Jewish film star. And here on the other side you'll see this is a concert that was given during the war, actually, to raise money for the UN refugee relief people that eventually resettled most of the stateless Jews of Shanghai. And you can see here that she's singing again. You can track these songs down. Some of these, there are recordings of some of these songs. She sang in English, she sang in Yiddish and German as well. Of course, those Austrian and German Jews even despite everything, had a great respect for a lot of German culture. And she kept on singing those. So she had that whole thing. What I don't know about her, and haven't been able to track down anywhere, none of those old Shanghai Lander Jews seem to know what happened, is what happened to her. Don't know where she went. She was certainly still there in 1946. Nothing seems to appear about her afterwards. There's no references to her. So there's no reference of her dying, although that was a fairly chaotic time. So it doesn't see, something must have happened to her. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that, like a lot of them, she went off to be a housewife in the suburbs of Melbourne or something, like a lot of them did. You know, not a happy end necessarily, but you know, it could have been Brisbane. You know, she did kind of. I don't know what happened to her. So if anyone ever comes across, you mention her name to any people you meet who know that time. I'd love to know what happened to her, because we don't know how to end the film either, which is a bit of a problem. Right, back to really dodgy Jews. Lily wasn't dodgy. Back to the really dodgy ones. This is Jukong Alley. Jukong Alley was again over in Hong Kong, a very bad street, brothels, prostitution, illegal gambling and so on. This is what happened to Jukong Alley around 1937-38. It was completely bombed by the Japanese because it was just over in Chinese Shanghai in Jiabei, and it was completely bombed out. Bit of a disaster. Not much fun sitting at the outside tables at that pub anymore, really. The thing about it is that there was the sort of king of Jukong Alley for many, many years, a couple of decades actually, was a guy called Sammy Weingarten. And he had a brother as well, who ran the Red Rose Cabaret. And there were a number of cabarets. There was the Venus and a few others on Jukong Alley. None of them started till about 1 o'clock in the morning. They were late dives. Big centres for White Russian prostitutes. Lots of gypsy music and entertainment, which whenever you see somewhere advertising itself with gypsy entertainment, you know that was somewhere where all sorts of stuff went on. And White Russian hostesses, run by Sammy Weingarten. About 1937, the police were called to the Red Rose Cabaret, which was a notorious sort of dive. There was always fights there and everything. They were called to the Red Rose Cabaret, and there was smoke coming out from under the door of Sammy Weingarten's office. He was the manager of it. He was 77 at the time, So, you know, still wanting to be running nightclubs at 4 o'clock in the morning at 77 is pretty good going. Let's hope the White Russian girls there weren't all 77 as well. But anyway, they were, the smoke was coming out. They managed to get in. His body was on fire. He'd been set alight. They managed to put him out. When they looked at the body, he didn't die from the fire. He'd already had his head smashed in. So someone had obviously killed him and then was trying to cover up the murder. Lots of people pulled in. Turned out he hadn't paid some of his Chinese staff. Maybe they didn't want to do it. He'd had a couple of altercations with various customers. Maybe that had been the problem. He had had a fight with his brother. Maybe it was an inter-family thing. There were so many suspects for who could have killed Sammy Weingarten. There were so many people in Shanghai who could have wanted him dead. Not least the fact that at that time there was basically the start of a war going on among various foreign-run gangs in Shanghai for complete control of the city. Remember that this was the start of the period of what's known as Solitary Island in Shanghai. After August 1937, the entire international settlement and French town was surrounded by the Japanese. There was an area to the west called the Badlands, which was kind of under nobody's control, but mostly was full of foreign-run casinos, nightclubs, brothels, dope dens, things like that, rather like the one in Peking that I've written about. So there was a war going on for control of the different areas of the city and people taking over things. There was hardly any effective policing in Shanghai by this point. The Chinese gangsters had gone. Most people don't realise this, but all the people we know, Big Ear Du, Pockmarked Huang, all those great guys, the Red Gang and the Green Gang were basically out of town. They had either gone with Du down here to Hong Kong, and then some to Chongqing. They either got out of the business, or they were working with Wang Jingwei and the puppet government, the collaborationist government, which was a mafia and a gang in itself, effectively. They ran the muscle for Wang Jingwei. Any and all of them could have been involved in this. There were various foreign gangs. The Portuguese had a big gang, which was very powerful and ran a lot of roulette wheels, and also, of course, had a lock on prostitution. And what they would do, there's a Jewish angle to this, they would persuade young Jewish girls to become prostitutes for a period for them in return for a visa to Macau. Of course, as you know, Portugal was neutral in the war. Lisbon was a wide open city. If you could get to Macau, then you could get a boat to Lisbon. If you didn't get sunk on either of those boats, when you got to Lisbon, you might be able to get to America or Britain or somewhere safer without your papers. And they would use girls as prostitutes for a while in return for a visa and the ability to get them to Macau and then ship them out through Macau to Lisbon. And you can track this. No one's written a book about this actually, but you can track this. You can see these Jewish names, and then you would do it for your whole family as well, going in on Portuguese ships down through Macau and then out to Lisbon, and then you can track them hanging around in Lisbon for a while, as the Jews did in Lisbon, and eventually getting papers to go to America or England. So there were any number of people who would have wanted to get it. The Portuguese, the puppet Chinese who were trying to take things over. There were lots of gangsters that were known as the Ronin, who flitted around, many of them Korean, who flitted around the Japanese military police and had control of things. It was in the Japanese interest to have everything destabilized. There were various American gangs that were run by Americans in the city as well, of non-Jewish extraction. And there was even a couple of dodgy Brits, there's always a dodgy Brit, running around causing trouble as well. And in Frenchtown, which most people forget, people always ask me, how come there never seems to be any French people in the internment camps? And you're like, we forget, Shanghai Frenchtown came under Vichy. It was part of the collaborationist regime. That's why the French weren't interned. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. And then there was another gang who also were accused of Sammy Weingarten's death, and there was a good reason for why they may have been in a fight with Sammy Weingarten, and that's because this was the big Jewish gang, if not the toughest gang in Shanghai. Now this is really interesting. This gang was run by a guy called Joe Farron. I should confess that this is the book I'm doing at the moment because it starts a year after the end of Midnight in Peking and takes on the war between two gangs in Shanghai that ended in that ran through 1940 and 41, which involved a lot of murders and a lot of killing, Chicago-style gangsterism, with one gang run by this man, Joe Farron, who owned a massive nightclub, the biggest nightclub in Shanghai in 1940, called Farron's. And he had his whole mob. I'll explain how he had a particularly tough mob that was all Jewish and all hard as nails. I'll explain how you get enough hard as nails Jews in Shanghai in 1940 in a minute. And he ran, the gang that opposed him was run by another guy that ran a lot of casinos and was known as the slots king of Shanghai, the sort of, you know, what the Americans would call one-armed bandits or fruit machine or something, called Jack Riley. Jack Riley wasn't born Jack Riley. He was born John Becker, and he came from Tulsa and escaped from Oklahoma State Prison and came to Shanghai, burnt his fingerprints off, and set himself up as a mobster. Joe Farron is our interesting character for this evening because he's Jewish. He's from the Jewish ghetto of Vienna as well. But he started out, his original name was Josef Polak. He started out as an exhibition dancer. If you know the story of George Raft, the actor, you know, who sort of came up that way as well. This is how Josef Polak started out. He started out as an exhibition dancer and a little bit of a, well, I don't know what the Yiddish term would be, a chipkus or whatever, right? You know, a toy boy, basically, who kind of seduced older, a gigolo, right? He seduced older women. That picture may not necessarily indicate it. He was always considered extremely good looking and just oozing charm. He had all the charm. And of course, he could dance like Fred Astaire and everything. They would do these exhibition dances at the ballrooms in Shanghai and he would do very well. He moved from that to become a choreographer. He ran Farron's Frolics, Farron's Follies. It was all kind of rip-off Ziegfeld stuff. And most famously, he ran the Paramount Peaches, who danced at the Paramount Ballroom in Shanghai, and were all absolutely gorgeous and absolutely fantastic. And you will see a picture of them in a minute. Came to Shanghai, decided he had got married to a woman who is known within his family as the old Trout. Managed to get some money out of her and then skipped town and got to Trieste and got on a boat to Shanghai, where he managed to do all of this. And he managed to make a little bit of money. He then managed to make a lot of money in a very illegal way. And I'm not going to tell you how to do that because you've got to come back and hear that story and buy the book when it comes out. But it's an amazing story that's never been told before. But one of the interesting things is he decided there wasn't quite enough money in dancing and running dance troupes. He managed to get a stake and open this massive nightclub that had roulette wheels and so on. He needed Jack Riley to run the roulette wheels, and the two of them got on very well until the day when they didn't get on very well, and then they went to all holy hell broke out at that point. But he's an interesting guy and generally quite a nice guy. Here's his club, Farron's. I know I've just said he's a gangster, so you'll have to understand that the old version of a gay gala and always the leaders of gaiety are applying here, right? It wasn't sort of a very modern place. You can see the sort of people he had. This is Volsky's Follies of 1941, Tatiana Svetlova, Lantsov, the Darnay sisters. These were all sort of acts. He'd bring them out from London and Europe. Mike's Music Masters of Swing. It was a real swanky club. It was really nice. I mean, it was like the Stork Club in New York. He modelled it on all that sort of thing. I mean, he did it with a lot of style. He was a very stylish guy. Here he is this is his night out. Everybody dressed up to go there. An old-fashioned waltz contest, that was his thing. But it was in the Badlands of Shanghai, this place. I mean, it was a dodgy area to go into. But he ran a very swell joint, and his roulette wheels just brought in masses and masses of money. When he came, he needed a partner, right? He needed his Ginger Rogers if he was going to be Fred Astaire. And he found a white Russian Jewish girl called Nellie. And he reinvented her and married her, actually, although I don't think he was faithful to her from day one. Since I've been researching him, I've had 4 people contact me to say that their mum was a mistress of Joe Farron. It's just endless. It's quite incredible the amount of women he went through. And Nellie was one of his. Nellie, he reinvented Nellie. This was, remember, in the 1920s. This was at the time when Josephine Baker was storming Paris, right? And the Revue Negre and all of that sort of thing was just incredible and doing very well. He billed her as Nellie, almost as Shanghai's Josephine Baker, and she didn't do the banana dance. As you can see, this is a sort of Aztec thing going on here or something, but pretty damn sexy for about 1927 or so on. They then went on. These are the Paramount Peaches. Nellie is obviously there front and centre directing it. I mean, it's an absolutely gorgeous costumes, big sets. I mean, they didn't do things on the cheap. Most of these girls are white Russian. I've got a lot of these pictures from, I can't remember which one it is now, I've got them circled somewhere. One of them, the daughter contacted me, unfortunately she just died aged 100, with lots and lots of stories and photographs of women who were in Paramount Peaches. Nellie eventually divorced Joe because he couldn't keep his hands off the peaches. But he did do these incredible shows that were really world class and very good. And Nellie was absolutely stunning. There's lots of photos of her where she's absolutely gorgeous. But it didn't really work. And eventually gang warfare broke out in February 1941. You know, eventually Jack Riley and Joe Farron went to war and tried to kill each other. Now, the interesting thing about this is how they ganged up. Jack Riley used ex-Marines, guys who'd, gone AWOL from the US Marines, who just would live for a fight, and he hired those, and they ran a very tough crew. Joe Farron didn't have a crew. He was a dancer. He couldn't call Nellie and the Peaches to sort out the Marines. That was, I'm sure they would have found a way to sort out some Marines. But he can do. So what he did was, and this was just pure chance for him, and no one has written about this, and it's just an incredible story, and I'll share it with you because you're Jewish. But don't tell anyone who's not, because we'll save it for the book, right? Because we've got to sell it to them. This is Walter Lunzer. In the late 1930s, when the Nazis were about to go into Vienna, and then when they went into Vienna, the Jews had to get out, right? So you had to get out, and we all know the stories of the Kindertransport, and we all know the stories of Jews who were able to get out at the last minute, and of course those that weren't, unfortunately. What people forget is that the Jewish mafia had to get out as well, right? There wasn't going to be any Jewish mafia under the Nazis, right? When the Nazis are in town, there's only one mafia, and it's them, right? So the Jewish mafia, and this is just an incredible story, pretty much by and large got on a boat and went to Shanghai. I mean, they were criminals. They didn't have any papers. Shanghai was one of the only places, I mean, you know, gangsters have no records, right? They don't like having passports. They don't pay taxes. They don't have bills in their name. It's always cash, nothing else, right? These guys couldn't really get anywhere else, and they had criminal records and everything. But they could get on a boat. They could come to Shanghai where you didn't need papers, you didn't need visas, you didn't need anything. And they came en masse. And Joe Farron heard that they'd come en masse, and he said, funnily enough, boys, I've got need of some very heavy guys out of the Jewish ghetto of Vienna. Right? These guys had been fighting Nazis 3 months before in street battles. They were all hired to do the muscle for Joe Farron's club, Farron's, and run the whole thing. And if you can track them back, because there's the names of them are mentioned in many of the reports about this at the time. And Walter Lunzer became Joe Farron's personal bodyguard. As you can see, bit of a difficult bloke to get past if he doesn't want you to get past him, right? Bit heavy. And he became his personal bodyguard and ran the door at Farron's. He decided who went in, who didn't go in, who went out on their arse, who went out through the window. Right? That was Walter Lunzer. And he ran the crew of ex-Viennese mafia guys, all Jewish, who eventually ended up fighting this war. February 1941, Jack Riley and his Marines burst into Farron, shoot the place up. He's on the door, they've got to get past him. Jack Riley walks up and shoots him straight between the eyes and he's dead. That was it, gang war on, basically. No one knew what to do except that they wanted to get Jack Riley. No one knew how to get Joe Farron. Joe Farron was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. He very cleverly never bothered to ask anyone for a passport. He was completely stateless. So there was no court to bring him in front of because he didn't have any nationality. Right? And if you asked him, no one even knew really what his real name was. Right? He erased himself. Jack Riley was a Yank, and they knew how to get a Yank, so they brought over a marshal. Now this is, who knew that Jews were taking down Al Capone as well, right? But this is Deputy US Marshal Sam Teitelbaum, or Teitelbaum, I guess he'd be in America, and he came over, and he literally, I mean, he is described at the time as being sort of half Gary Cooper and half a sort of, Al Capone type sort of guy. He literally started walking around Shanghai when it's completely lawless with a pump-action shotgun, but dressed up with all the gear because he's just come from Chicago and everything, swearing that he's going to take down Jack Riley. And he actually, I mean, I'm not going to tell you how it all ends, but it all ends up back over in the old areas of the trenches and Yukon Alley, with this guy literally hunting down Jack Riley in the bombed out houses over there, walking through just firing shotguns at him. I won't tell you if he got him or not and then what happened, because there's several twists, one of which involves Mr. Teitelbaum, which was quite amazing as well. But he was basically this guy, Jewish marshal from Chicago, brought over to take down America's biggest criminal in Shanghai in 1941. An absolutely incredible story. And again, he's smiling and everything there, but he was just obviously hard as nails as well. He had gone up against the Italian mob in Chicago before and had done that. I'll finish then with one little place. These photos are crap because iPhone cameras are crap and the air in Shanghai is awful, so I can't really do it. This is the old theatre in the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai. I live around the corner from it actually, and there's one story that I was reading about. It was a place where a lot of the various you know, criminals, the fences, right, the people who traded stolen goods and stuff in the ghetto during the war, used to go and gather. But so did a lot of other people. In the hot summer nights they would go up there, and on the roof was a place called Roy's Roof Garden. It's now an internet bar and you can't get up on the roof, and they've sort of not used it anymore, though the steps are all there to get up there. But it's just, I just love the idea of these guys in the ghetto, which of course you needed passes to get in and out of during that time, up on that roof. And if you go up to the internet cafe at the top and you look out, apart from the new buildings, you look out over the whole of Hong Kong, which was, you know, still part of the international settlement, and you look out across at Pudong or Putong at that time, which would have been mostly go-downs and warehouses and farms. And you think these guys must have sat up there looking out at this whole world that they couldn't actually go out into. And they had a band up there, and they literally danced till dawn on the hot summer nights when no one was going to sleep anywhere. And it was one of those places that people escaped to try and remember some of the sort of former pleasant life they had had back in Europe and everything that, of course, had been destroyed when they'd had to come to Shanghai and the ghetto. And I just think that, you know, people walk past this building all the time and they forget that, you know, once upon a time in sort of 1942, 1943, 1944, the roof would have been full of Jews waltzing around to an all-Jewish band and everything. And I think that would have been rather lovely. I don't have a story about anyone getting thrown off the roof, unfortunately, but yeah, that would have been there. So that's some sort of bad Jews. I've got to, obviously, I'm not totally good myself, so I'm going to plug completely. And I'm still sort of digging up people's lives and trying to find out more about people. But as I say, at the moment, I'm sort of full on with Joe Farron and Jack Riley. Amazingly, I managed to track his family down. I really, really wanted to find his family because I wanted lots of pictures and I knew that they would have them. And this is sort of an interesting story to me. I spend a lot of time trying to contact people, and I tried everywhere to do it, and I just thought, Vienna, 1930s, Joe got out early, he had these brothers and sisters, you know, if they didn't get out, and I couldn't find any record of them leaving and going anywhere, you know, I kind of know that this story is not going to end well, right? It's going to end badly. And I sort of was telling everyone what I was doing and trying to find things, and had written a little bit on something on the internet about Joe Farron and saying I really wanted to track down the family and everything. And I got an email from a woman who said, oh, can I give you a phone because I don't like email? And she phoned me up, and she was Joe Farron's brother. She was the daughter of Joe Farron's brother. She's now sort of lady in her 70s. And his family all managed to get out, just about one of the last families to get out before the border really did close. And they managed to get to England, where they were sent from London to the charming town of Gloucester, where her father took on the Underwood typewriter franchise and sold all the typewriters basically from Gloucester down to Devon, Somerset and Cornwall and Bristol and everything. And the family had done very well. And I went searching all over for this family, thinking, well, if they got out, they'd be in America or somewhere like that. And it turned out they were living in a little village outside Gloucester and had this notion that there was a rakish sort of, there was this slightly black sheep in the family that they'd heard had gone off to Shanghai at some sort of point, and they didn't know anything more about him. But that was just amazing to me. You search high and low for someone and you find out that they're just sitting there. She's like the most English woman I've ever met. I went down and had tea with her and everything, and I'm just like, I didn't know there were Jews like this in England. I didn't know in little villages that bloody midsummer murders comes to. It was unbelievable. Who knew that they existed? I certainly didn't. Didn't know there was anyone north of Golders Green. So that was that basically. And so people do keep popping out of the woodwork. Anyway, well, thank you very much. I hope I haven't shattered any illusions about anything. If there is a question, someone wants to ask one, I'll try and answer it. So.
Yes, Paul, what happened in the Japanese period to all these dives and nightclubs?
Oh, well, they all kept going. I mean, you know, the Farron's War was in 41. I mean, that area, after Pearl Harbor, of course, when the Japanese took over the international settlement, a lot of those people were, of course, interned. There's a very bad story about what happened to Joe Farron, Jack Riley and everything. A little bit did keep going, a little bit in like the midnight of Peking. I mean, they kept that area going for any foreigners that were still around. But of course, you know, the Brits were all Empire of the Sun, and you know, the Americans as well. As I say, the French kept running riot because they were under Vichy control, so there was no control on the French. And there were any number, I mean, everyone talks about the Jews in the ghetto, but people forget that there were a lot of Jews who had managed to get papers from the French and various other places who were living in Frenchtown, who were able to stay in action. Of course, once the Japanese took over the international settlement and effectively took control of Frenchtown as well, I mean, you know, they took over the business. But they kept running things. I mean, all the White Russians still were out there, you know. I mean, they had nowhere to go. They had nowhere. They had nowhere to intern them. And they had nothing to do with them, so they just left them there as prostitutes, the way that they did in Peking as well. So yeah, and the Japanese, of course, were the biggest dope dealers in China. I mean, they had been flooding China with opium for a long, long time in order to sap the will of the Chinese people to resist, you know, particularly in Peking, but also into Shanghai. But the problem in Shanghai was that there were so many people dealing dope. The Chinese gangs were still dealing dope. The Corsicans, with the original French connection, right, were dealing dope out of Indochina into Shanghai as well. There were American connections to dealing dope. It was like everybody was a drug dealer, it seems, at some point in Shanghai. So the Japanese got in on that business as well. But, you know, I mean, the Japanese authorities in Shanghai were completely corrupt. They were in bed with Wang Jingwei's regime, which of course was just completely corrupt. And so, you know, lots of gangsters did. And as you know, if you've read Midnight in Peking and so on, and there's more in the little Badlands book about this, which is, you know, any number of Americans and Brits and others did in fact collaborate with the Japanese to stay in business. I have one person, it's very, I'm not sure quite if I'll ever meet her, but there's one woman, there's one character in Midnight in Peking who's actually British and not Jewish, so rest easy. But he collaborated with the Japanese, and then eventually was put on a boat back to England. He collaborated with the Japanese for a long time, and when he got back to England, he was arrested during the war under what was called Regulation 18B, which is what they arrested sort of Oswald Mosley and other people under. Sort of anyone who collaborated with the Nazis or the Japanese was arrested and interned in Britain. And he was arrested and interned during the war as a potential enemy sympathiser. And of course I wrote this, and the records are all there, you can see everything, and I mentioned it. And I get an email from his granddaughter, and of course it's never been mentioned in the family. They know they had granddad went out to China, had a nice life. There was some business in the war and he came back, but no one's quite sure what happens. He's never talked about it, he's just talked about the nice times he had in Peking. And all of a sudden she's wandered in and thought, oh, there's a book on Peking, I'll read that, granddad was out there. And she reads it, and it turns out granddad's a Nazi. So I can't think of many things that it would be worse to tell someone about their ancestors if you're English than granddad was a Nazi. She took it very badly at first, but I sent her photocopies of all the police records and everything of the trial that he had for under Regulation 18B. And she's now, I'm glad to say, embracing it fully and writing a biography of him and how he ended up in this position and everything. But once you start digging into people's families, you do turn up some odd stuff.
So beware. Anybody else? There? Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I have a question.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, in your book Midnight in Peking, one of your main characters is Esther Gurevich. Okay, in Midnight in Peking, one of your characters is Esther Gurevich, and as you know from our emails, she is related to Mary Block of our community.
She's not.
She's not related to Mary Block. How could that be?
No, Mary says not.
Okay, all right. So do you know what happened to Esther?
Well,
She wasn't a prostitute.
no, she was not a prostitute. She was a friend of Pamela's, and she was one of the last people to see. They were ice skating that evening, actually at the invitation of the British family, who the father turned out to be a Nazi. But they went ice skating, and Pamela's last words were to Ethel Gurevich, who went away. The family was questioned. It all seemed to be above board. I must admit that there was rumours in the files. People did tell Werner when he was investigating it, that girl knows more than she's saying, right? So apologies to anyone who's the family of that person. But there was no evidence that she did know more than what she was saying, so I just reported that there was rumours that she knew more, but I don't speculate in the book about what she may or may not have known about that. More, and of course I didn't follow up what happened to her afterwards, because she sort of goes out of the story at that point. But they were an interesting family in that they were living on a nice street in a nice area, and seemed to be very well settled and part of the whole community and so on. As I say, I had been at school with Pamela, and there was another friend of theirs. So I'm fascinated to know that she went on to have a longer life and everything. It would be lovely to know though if she did know any more and never said it. Because so many people in that story, it turns out, knew but didn't say for various reasons. And so what she knew would have been lovely to know.
Okay, folks.
Thank you.